Right, now I'm going to play another interview I did there with a fellow called Andrew Gallimore, who's a chemical pharmacologist, and he works at York University right now in computational neuroscience. He did a talk about alien worlds in the DMT experience at the conference, and here he starts off by talking about this familiar space visited in the DMT experience that Alexander also talked about in that previous interview. You're listening to NTS Radio.
One sort of mines through sort of countless trip reports, both online and from those subjects of Rick Strassman with his pioneering study in the 90s. You tend to see, more often than is easy to explain, extremely advanced, often described as hyper-technological realities inhabited by beings, various types of entities. Elves are talked about a lot, very small, lively beings that play sometimes with the user, that are often quite mischievous. I mean, Terence McKenna was, his discussions about the elves are pretty legendary in the psychedelic community, and elves do appear a lot, and I've spoken to many people who've taken DMT and who do describe these elves, whether these are this sort of typical, stereotypical Celtic elves, or whether these are just, it's kind of a good word to describe these small creatures that actually are probably beyond any sort of ordinary description. So they appear quite a lot. So these extremely advanced entities often accompany the elves, extremely powerful, and many users get the sense that the beings that they are communicating with sometimes are often far more powerful and far more intelligent than we could even comprehend. So it's those commonalities, those aspects of the DMT experience that appear again and again that particularly pique my interest.
Your research then concerns how that exists within the brain?
Yeah, I mean, basically, what a lot of people don't realise, people can get into quite lengthy and heated discussions about whether the DMT world is real or not. But unfortunately, it's not a particularly fruitful endeavour, because what do we mean by real for a start? But the position I come from is that whenever a world appears to consciousness, it must have an informational representation in the brain. So what that means is, I'm not saying that the brain creates consciousness or the brain is creating these worlds as such, but that if a world does appear to consciousness, there must be the information must be represented in the brain. And we know that the consensus world, as I call it, the world that we're all in now, is mainly a result of intrinsic activities, ongoing activity in the brain. So your brain represents the the consensus world as a default state, and very little information is actually used from outside. Very little sensory data, contrary to what you might intuitively think, is actually used from the outside world. What data from the outside world does is modulate and constrain ongoing activity in the brain, which constructs this reality, if you like, as a default state.
And is that due to strengthening of certain connections in the cortical columns?
Correct, yes. So the cortex is really billions of cortical columns, each with a different role in representing the informational structure of the world. And it's this pattern of activation in these cortical columns is one way of thinking about how the brain represents information, because there are practically an infinite number of possible activation patterns of these cortical columns. And through evolution, by sampling sensory data from the external world, certain cortical columns would be naturally activated, and you get a strengthening of connections. And what that means is that eventually certain patterns of activation become more likely. and these patterns of activation tend to represent the consensus world as a default. So the brain wasn't dropped to earth ready to start interacting with the world. It had to evolve that ability. And so really, as far as neuroscience can tell you, the brain only knows how to construct one world, and that's this world, and that's what we would normally think. And even the dream world appears to be, in its gross form at least, a representation of normal waking world. In fact, the patterns of brain activity are basically the same. So what's really amazing and shocking is that the brain is even capable of constructing these bizarre alien realities with such exquisite, convincing detail that people believe they are almost more real than the consensus world.
So you would suggest that this world also exists within the brain?
The way I see it, the brain must have evolved this ability to construct these realities. I don't think it's an accident that when you ingest 50 milligrams of DMT, the brain just by chance happens to be able to construct these worlds. That doesn't sit well with me scientifically and in my gut either. So I think the brain must have learned to construct these worlds. Now, if we assume that the brain learned to construct the DMT world in a similar way that it learned to construct the consensus world, and there seems to be one way the brain knows and learns to construct world, which is through sampling of sensory data, that suggests that perhaps the brain must have been able to somehow sample sensory data from some other reality, which would suggest perhaps that it is real, or it does have some sort of autonomous existence. But it's difficult to say whether these worlds are real or whether they are somehow perhaps fragments of the collective unconscious. I mean, there are many different angles you can take on this, and I'm not definitive in terms of whether these are real, but they certainly appear exquisitely real. So there have been studies that have looked for DMT, particularly in the pineal gland, but I'm not overly convinced yet that there is sufficient data that would suggest that DMT is produced by the pineal gland. The problem is it's quite difficult to know. People have suggested, for example, and it's become almost a common myth, that DMT produces dreams because it's released during sleep. Again, this really goes back possibly to the musings of Terence McKenna, who spoke about it on a number of occasions, but there has been a formal proposal back in the 80s that DMT might be responsible for dreaming. But to be honest, if you really examine the nature of the DMT experience, compare it to dreaming, they are completely different. Another suggestion is that DMT is released at death, perhaps to facilitate the exit of the soul from the body, and this comes from Rick Strassman's book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, but it has been propagated almost as fact. So you have to kind of separate the fact from the fiction, and it would be nice if DMT was released by the pineal, because the pineal is this enigmatic organ in the brain that has since ancient times been associated with the spiritual world and perhaps the connection between the human and the spiritual world. It's often identified with the third eye, but it might be just wishful thinking.
So you don't really know that much about the pineal gland?
Well, currently the orthodox position, and what we know about the pineal gland, is the pineal gland produces melatonin. Now, melatonin is a tryptamine, but it's not psychoactive. It's released during darkness and is involved with the sleep-wake cycle. So it's a neurohormone that is involved. It's produced when the sun goes down, get less light information being sent to the pineal gland, and this pineal gland starts to produce melatonin, and this makes you sleepy.
So does it have a direct correlation to serotonin level?
No. However, serotonin production does drop off during REM sleep. So my idea is that basically I think it's possible. DMT has a number of what you might call pharmacological peculiarities It's extremely simple molecule. It looks like it's not going to have really any activity based on its structure. It looks far too simple. It's very, very rapidly metabolized by the brain. It's transported through very specific transporters into neurons, which might suggest that it has a long-standing relationship with the brain. And what I suggest is that you can think of DMT perhaps as what I call an ancestral neuromodulator. So a neurochemical that was once produced by the brain but is no longer. Now, it's possible that if DMT used to be produced by the pineal gland, that just like now melatonin is triggered by darkness, DMT production could have been triggered by darkness. So as the brain enters REM sleep, although serotonin production comes down, DMT production is or was ramped up. And this would mean that the old form of dreaming perhaps would have been the point at which the human would navigate these other realities. And in fact, what you can imagine is that the brain, if this was happening night after night throughout life and throughout the course of evolutionary time, the brain would actually learn to construct a completely separate reality. And what this would explain is why when you reconstitute the DMT in the brain by smoking it, the brain is very rapidly able to shift from constructing the consensus world and within 30 seconds start constructing this alien reality. That would possibly explain it, and I call this parallel neural evolution.
So it's possible that in the past human beings existed on parallel lives.
Precisely, yeah. So during the day, the brain would learn to construct the consensus world, and so the individual, the humans, would be interacting and learning to construct this world, which we know, of course, this happened, because we're here now perfectly capable of constructing exquisite and beautiful consensus reality. But at the same time, during the night, particularly or possibly during REM sleep, the brain would learn to construct this reality. So yes, we would be living parallel lives, a life during the waking hours and a life during sleep.
Why would you suppose that the brain stopped secreting DMT?
That's a really good question, and we don't know the answer. There's a guy called Tony Wright who's quite interested in the way that neural function has perhaps declined, and a number of people now are discussing the idea that neural function the last 50 to 100,000 years hasn't improved, has actually declined, and we're actually in a regressing, precisely. And there are a number of reasons that might be the case. It could be to do with diet, and Tony Wright suggests that it's because we moved from a purely fruit-based diet as we left the forests, perhaps, and started eating meat and vegetables and that kind of thing. Because it is known that diet can affect neural function. It has been shown by a number of groups that diet can affect production of various chemicals in the brain. So it's possible that it's a dietary thing. Are you
going to endorse a plant-based lifestyle?
No, I'm not. I mean, there are obvious benefits that are well known about a plant-based lifestyle, but in terms of, if we have lost this ability to make DMT in psychedelic concentrations, so I'm not talking about trace amounts that we find in the brain. The problem really is that DMT is such a simple molecule. It's pretty unsurprising, because serotonin is a tryptamine that's made from tryptophan, which is an amino acid. So it's actually just two chemical reactions required to go from tryptophan to serotonin. It's the same for DMT, and the enzymes that would carry out this process are very common in the body. So to find very small concentrations of DMT in the brain, not surprising at all. If we found what I would call psychedelic concentrations in the brain, that would be interesting. But I'm not overly excited by research that finds traces.
Going back to why we've lost.
Yeah. So another possibility is, other than a dietary factor, it could be simply to do with the fact that human beings perhaps drifted from this other reality and became more cemented in the consensus world. and perhaps loss of development of the modern form of dreaming, although whilst people have speculated about the role of dreaming in life, actually there isn't any firm consensus that dreaming has adaptive benefits, but it may well do, and it probably does, and it's possible that modern REM sleep, which actually produces representations of the consensus world, may have benefits for our life in the consensus world. So we may have become more fixed in the consensus world, and that may have selected out of this parallel lives into a more unified life in the consensus world, and we've just lost that function. Basically, the answer is we don't know why we lost this function if we had it.
I was wondering if you could explain this idea of John Mack's, I think, ontological shock?
Ontological shock, yeah. Well, John Mack was a psychiatrist at Harvard. He's no longer with us, but he was really the first proper academic to take so-called abductees, and he would normally regress them under hypnosis to relive these experiences. And what John Mack noted, other than the fact that these individuals were not psychotic, they didn't seem to have any underlying psychological or neurological pathology, he found that for a start there were lots and lots of commonalities between the experience. So whilst there were many different individuals from diverse backgrounds, they often describe the same process during the abduction and what was carried out on them, experimented upon, etc. And the descriptions of the ships were always very, very similar. So he didn't understand that. He couldn't explain that apart from saying that it had already happened. But in terms of the individual, John Mack coined this term ontological shock, because if you have a particularly horrific dream, for example, you might wake up shivering and sweating, but you don't think, oh my God, this really happened. You know that it was a dream, no matter how bizarre it was. But with these alien abductions, these individuals are utterly, completely convinced, and so convinced that these beings exist. So this is where we get the ontological part from. But they are completely shocked that this is actually real, because you can't comprehend actually that there are these aliens that are able to interact and come into your bedroom and abduct you. And so it's the sense of that what just happened to me is absolutely 100% real, and nobody is going to convince me otherwise. And with DMT, you get a similar thing. People are often extremely shocked because whilst these worlds are utterly bizarre and of such astonishing complexity that it's difficult to even comprehend, they have this strong conviction that these worlds are real, and often more real, and it shocks them to realize that there's this reality going on right now.
Hyper real, yeah.
Yeah, it's hyper real, exactly, and that shocks them. So that's the shock. It's a deep internal shock, and you realize something that you had no idea. And that's the first thing that happens when you take a hit of DMTs. Oh my God. I think the first time I did it, all I could say was, oh my God. Lying on my bed, shaking, literally shaking. That's all I could say, because you get this shock of this is happening, this is real, and it's going on all the time. We had no idea. Most people will never know. And it's very easy to say to somebody, oh, it's just a hallucination. You were hallucinating. But and John Mack got that a lot, and he would normally say, what the F do they know about hallucination? Because often it wasn't psychiatrists, it was often other scientists were saying it's just hallucinations. But psychiatrists understand hallucinations, and they understand where they come from, and they tend to be related to the individual sort of psychological idiosyncrasies, etc. But these are not. They're nothing like that. They don't seem to be related at all to the consensus world or to the individual psychology, and yet they possess these commonalities.
It's interesting, the parallels between actual alien abductees and then the DMT alien world.
Yeah, I mean, this is this has been pointed out before, and people have suggested perhaps that spontaneous production of DMT in the brain might trigger these experiences. However, I'm not convinced, simply because there aren't enough parallels. There are similarities, but they don't seem to be the same experience. However, what is interesting is some of John Mack's abductees noted that the aliens seem to change their consciousness, change their neurology, so that they were able to access their realm. Now, it's possible that they are using perhaps DMT in order to facilitate the individual, so perhaps the individual doesn't actually leave the bed as such, but they're able to somehow direct their mind into this reality. And that's more feasible, I think, because simply saying that DMT is spontaneously released by the brain, that would produce the same varieties of experience that you would get when people smoke DMT. But it's possible that if these aliens are in fact administering the DMT, they might be able to control. So it might be in the same reality.